My son sat there during the will reading, wearing that self-satisfied grin, convinced I wouldn't see a penny of his mother's $46 million inheritance. But everything changed the moment the lawyer read just one line. Jason's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a scream so loud it seemed to shake the office walls. Back in my apartment, my coffee cup slipped from my hands, crashing into the linoleum and shattering into 100 pieces, just as Mrs. Evans's voice boomed through the thin wall. "Your sprinklers are flooding my begonias again, Robert." I grabbed a dish towel and knelt among the ceramic shards. At 66, I was still cleaning up messes that weren't entirely mine. The automatic sprinkler system I'd installed last month had one loose joint, and every few days, water would spill over into her yard. I tried explaining my repair schedule to her, but patience wasn't Sophia Evans's strong suit. The phone rang. I ignored it, kneeling there, mopping up the coffee puddle. The machine could handle it, but the persistent ringing cut through Sophia's yelling about property lines and inconsiderate tenants. On the fifth ring, I finally stood, tossing the soaked towel into the sink. "Robert Sterling speaking." "Mr. Sterling, this is Maria Williams from Williams Welsh & Associates in Cheyenne," the woman said, her voice that precise, professional tone that usually meant bad news was coming. "I'm calling about Laura and Sterling." My hand tightened around the receiver. Nobody had called Laura by her full name around me in 15 years. "What about her?" "I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Sterling passed away Tuesday evening. The funeral is scheduled for Friday at 3 o'clock at Riverside Memorial Chapel." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the kitchen chair, the familiar creak suddenly deafening in the silence. Tuesday evening, 3 days ago. 3 days I'd spent worrying about sprinklers and coffee stains. "Mr. Sterling, are you there?" "Yes. I'm here," I said, my voice sounding distant, almost unreal. "How did you get my number?" I asked. "You were listed as an emergency contact in Mrs. Sterling's personal effects. I understand you were previously married." "Previously married," I repeated quietly. 22 years condensed into a legal footnote. "Yes. We divorced in 2009. "I see. There will be a reading of the will after the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence is requested." Beneficiary. The word felt alien. Laura had built her empire after our divorce, transforming that tiny consulting business she started during our marriage into something I barely recognized in the papers. What on earth could she have left me? "Mr. Sterling, will you be attending?" Through the kitchen window, I saw Sophia Evans checking her waterlogged begonias, hands on her hips, ready for another argument. But her complaints felt distant now, almost meaningless. "The chapel," I said slowly. "Which one?" "Riverside Memorial on Grand Avenue. The service starts at 2, followed by a brief reception. The will reading is at 4:40 in our downtown offices." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I'll be there." After I hung up, I stayed in the chair, staring at the phone as if it might ring again with different news. Coffee stains had already started setting into the floor, dark rings that would need scrubbing, but I couldn't move. I couldn't process that Laura, vibrant, stubborn, impossible Laura, was gone. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes that drifted like the memories I'd tried so hard to forget. Her full name echoed in my mind, Laura and Sterling, each syllable pulling me back to January 1988, Murphy's Diner, a snowy evening. I remembered watching her argue with the manager in that red wool coat. "You're telling me you won't consider women for weekend manager because they can't handle the pressure?" Her voice cut through the nearly empty diner, sharp and unyielding. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week." I froze mid-bite of my apple pie, fork paused in midair. Her profile came into view, high cheekbones, a firm jaw, dark hair catching the fluorescent light. She was breathtaking in her anger, and I found myself hoping the manager would keep arguing so I could listen. "Ma'am, I didn't mean to offend." "Of course you didn't. You just meant to discriminate. She slid a business card across the counter. When you decide to hire based on qualifications, call me. The door jingled as she left. The diner felt smaller, drained. I watched her climb into a blue Honda Civic, careful, deliberate, unafraid to stand up for what was right. That one's trouble, the manager muttered. No, I said to myself, a certainty I didn't expect. That one's extraordinary. The card lay abandoned. Laura Seen, business consultant. I memorized her number before stepping out into the February wind. It took 3 days to work up the nerve to call. When I finally did, she picked up on the second ring. Laura Seen, she said briskly. This is Robert Sterling. We haven't met, but I saw you at Murphy's Diner on Friday night. A pause. The man with the apple pie who defended my honor to the manager. You heard that? I was getting my gloves from the car. You left a good tip too. I could hear her smile. So, Robert Sterling, what can I do for you? Have dinner with me somewhere better than Murphy's? I asked. There was a pause, longer this time. Are you asking me on a date, or do you need business consulting? Definitely a date, I said. Though, if you have any advice on how to convince beautiful women to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation. She laughed, a real laugh, not the polite, careful chuckle women sometimes give when men try to be charming. Saturday night. Romano's on 3rd Street. 7 o'clock, she said. She showed up wearing that same red coat, but underneath was a black dress that made my pulse race. We talked for hours, 3, maybe, about everything except work. She told me about her childhood in California, I talked about my job at the power plant, and together we discovered a shared love for old movies and newer books. When she laughed at my story about flooding my apartment while trying to fix a leaky faucet, I realized I was falling for her. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner, sliding a ring across the counter where she'd left her business card years before. Marry me, Brianna Chen. Make me the luckiest man in Wyoming. She said yes before I even finished asking. Our wedding day was bathed in September sunshine, perfect weather for promises. Brianna wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked that morning. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto her finger. Forever, she whispered, and I believed it completely. 2 years later, Jason arrived, a squalling, red-faced miracle who turned our quiet little house into a home alive with purpose. I remember standing in that hospital room, watching Brianna cradle him with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, and thinking, this is all I'll ever need. But even then, I noticed it, her eyes drifting to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. As Jason grew from toddler to schoolboy, little things started to reveal themselves, things I'd missed in those blissful first years. When he turned 7, Brianna bought him a real computer, not a toy, a machine worth more than my monthly paycheck. He needs to understand technology, she said, watching him navigate programs I'd never even heard of. The future belongs to kids who think digitally. I suggested teaching him to fish instead. She laughed, but there was no warmth in it. By then, we had moved to Hillrest Avenue, into a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Brianna's consulting firm had landed a contract with a mining consortium, and suddenly, money wasn't a problem. We had a housekeeper twice a week, a fridge that dispensed ice through the door, and Jason's bedroom looked like a toy store exploded. Isn't this wonderful? Brianna said one evening, sweeping her hand across the new dining room with its crystal chandelier and massive table that seated 12. We can finally entertain properly. I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from Jason's coloring projects and late-night conversations. This new one reflected light like a mirror, showing every fingerprint, demanding coasters and placemats. Entertaining started immediately, business associates, potential clients, other successful couples discussing market share and investment strategies. I wore my best shirt, tried to join in, but talk of hedge funds and corporate restructuring left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly. Robert works at the power plant, Brianna would explain when someone asked, her voice carrying not pride but a subtle apology, as if my job required justification. Jason thrived in this world. By 10, he could discuss programming with Brianna's tech-savvy clients. By 12, he was critiquing wine choices at restaurants I couldn't afford. By 14, he rolled his eyes at my suggestion of family camping trips, preferring Brianna's conferences in Denver and Salt Lake City. "Dad doesn't understand," became his go-to phrase, usually with an exasperated sigh that made me feel old and obsolete. Our first real fight came on Jason's 15th birthday. Brianna had planned a party that looked like a corporate networking event, catered food, hired entertainment, guest list full of business contacts and their kids. I'd envisioned something simpler, a barbecue in our backyard with his school friends. "This is embarrassing," I said the night before, watching servers arrange elaborate flower arrangements. "He's 15, not 50. He's growing up in a different world than we did, Robert," she said, adjusting a centerpiece with the same precision she brought to contract negotiations. "These connections matter. These relationships will shape his future." "What about being just a kid?" I asked. For a moment, I saw a cold calculation in her eyes where warmth had once lived. "Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give him. The world is competitive. Either we prepare him to win, or we prepare him to lose." I thought about my own 15th birthday, fishing with my dad, a homemade cake, presents wrapped in newspaper comics. Simple, perfect. By Brianna's standards, the party was a success. Jason charmed the adults, received gifts worth more than I'd ever dreamed, a laptop, designer clothes, a mountain bike pricier than some cars. But I caught him once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost among all the sophistication. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Brianna had helped him build. Of course, why wouldn't I be? For just a moment, though, I saw the confused little boy beneath all that premature polish, and it broke my heart. That party was the beginning of the end, though I didn't realize it then. The next 10 years were a slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of the mountain, inevitable, destructive, unstoppable. Brianna's business consumed more of her time, attention, and soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacations were cancelled for client emergencies. School events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," Brianna would say whenever I complained about missing another of Jason's baseball games. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I knew pressure. The kind that came from keeping an entire power grid running, from making sure thousands of people had light when they flipped their switches. My kind of pressure served something bigger than myself. By the time Jason graduated from high school, he felt like a stranger. Brianna had molded him into her ideal protege, sharp, ambitious, and dismissive of anything that didn't advance his career prospects. When I suggested he consider trade school along with college applications, he looked at me like I'd suggested he become a medieval knight. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking holding you back," he said, 17, already speaking like a business consultant. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words landed like punches. Settled for mediocrity. As if 25 years of keeping the lights on for our community meant nothing. As if simply being a steady, present father was shameful. College only made things worse. Jason chose Brianna's alma mater for business school, naturally, and came home during holidays full of lectures on market dynamics and personal optimization. He'd look at our house, our lives, our values, with barely concealed disdain. "You could do more, Dad," he'd say, as if my contentment was a crime. "Some things matter more than money," I'd try to tell him. But he'd already stopped listening. The final explosion came during his senior year. Brianna had been working 100-hour weeks on some massive acquisition deal. I'd been holding down the home front, grocery shopping, laundry, all the little tasks that made life run. When she missed Jason's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. "This is enough, Brianna. Family has to come first sometimes." She stood in our kitchen, that shrine to success of crystal and granite, still in her business suit at midnight, eyes on her phone. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Jason's accomplished, exists because of my work. What about everything we've lost?" I asked. "Like what?" She finally looked up, genuinely puzzled. "Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw it there before she spoke. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is working," she said quietly. The divorce took 6 months. Her lawyers were efficient, professional, merciless. I got our old starter home on Maple Street and enough money to live modestly. She got everything else, including Jason's unquestioned loyalty. "You're holding him back, too," Jason told me in one of our final conversations before moving to Denver to work for her company. "All this guilt about family values and simple living, it's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that negativity anymore." I sat alone in that empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I loved most. 15 years later, the afternoon light was fading outside my apartment window. My coffee had gone cold. The ceramic shards from the spill still littered the floor. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the woman who'd once promised me forever. And I had no idea why she'd remembered my name in her will. The 3 days between Maria Williams's call and the funeral passed in a strange, suspended haze. I cleaned the apartment twice, pressed my one good suit, rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Each morning I considered skipping the service, but every evening I found myself committed to showing up, whatever the cost. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, typical May weather in Wyoming. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Brianna would think of the man I'd become. The reflection staring back at me looked older than I felt inside, silver where brown had been, lines mapping decades of quiet disappointment. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that told the story of Rock Springs' economic divide. My modest apartment complex gave way to middle-class subdivisions, then to manicured lawns and stone facades where Brianna's circle lived. The chapel sat on a hill, its Gothic spires suggesting permanence and prosperity. Cars lined the circular drive, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, even a few Teslas that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year. I parked my 15-year-old Honda between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like an intruder at someone else's celebration. Inside, the chapel whispered wealth. Mahogany pews, stained glass windows, flowers arranged with precision. At least 200 people filled the space, their low conversations mixing respectful mourning with subtle networking. I recognized a few faces from the business dinners Brianna had dragged me to, but most were strangers from her life after me. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to stay unnoticed, but whispers followed me like ripples across still water. A woman in a black suit nudged her companion, discreetly pointing in my direction. Her ex-husband. Can you believe him, after all he put her through? The stories had grown over the years. In this version, I was the villain, the anchor holding back a brilliant woman, the obstacle to her success. I had long ago learned not to argue with narratives that served other people's need for simple explanations. Dad. The voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. I looked up to see Jason striding down the aisle, face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled anger. At 38, Jason had inherited Brianna's sharp features and commanding presence. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Success seemed to radiate from him like heat off asphalt, an expensive watch, a perfect haircut, the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. What are you doing here? His voice carried across the chapel, turning heads and silencing murmurs. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something sophisticated, aggressive. She wouldn't want you here. Maybe not. But I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience. To play the grieving widower for people who know exactly what kind of husband you were. The chapel had gone completely silent. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on us, like spectators at some spectacle. I felt that familiar weight of judgment, the same suffocating pressure that had haunted me in the final years of our marriage. But this time, there was nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Jason. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. You'll leave now. His voice rose another notch, and the murmurs of the crowd reflected approval. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Don't make it worse by pretending to grieve her death. I stayed standing, holding his stare. Around us, the chapel buzzed, a low hum of anticipation. A cough. A phone vibrating against wood. Before I could respond, Jason turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding a room. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. He gestured toward me with the casual dismissal of someone swatting a fly. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered agreement. I felt my face grow hot but forced myself to remain calm. For those who don't know, Jason continued, warming to his theme, this is Robert Sterling, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this town has ever seen. While my mother built an empire that employed hundreds, he was content to punch a time clock and complain about her ambitions. Jason, that's enough, I said, sharper than intended. Is it? He said, turning back to the crowd like a prosecutor addressing a jury. He took half her assets in the divorce despite contributing nothing to her success. Then he spent 15 years acting like the victim while she built something magnificent. The crowd leaned in, fully engaged, some nodding in agreement. I recognized faces, former neighbors, people I'd once considered friends, but none met my eyes. She supported him for years while he refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner she deserved. And now that she's gone, he shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered in her life. Each word hit like a physical blow, not entirely untrue, but it reduced 22 years of marriage to a simple story of failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexities, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility. But what was the point? These people had already chosen their story. My mother died building something that will outlast all of us, Jason concluded, his voice rising with conviction. She deserved a husband who would have helped her reach those heights, not one who dragged her down to his level. The chapel went silent. I stood exposed, the weight of 200 judgmental eyes pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to walk out, to escape the humiliation, but another part, the part that had loved Briannichin more than anything, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Jason's eyes flashed, surprised. He had expected me to crumble, to slink away. His confidence wavered for just a moment. I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 22 of them as her husband, 18 more as someone who wished her well, despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory. I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Jason froze in the aisle, unprepared for resistance to his public trial. The service will begin in 5 minutes, someone announced from the front, probably the funeral director, trying to restore order to his carefully orchestrated event. Jason shot me one last look of contempt before striding to the front pew, reserved for family. As conversations resumed, I caught snippets of gossip, nerve of some people. Poor Jason having to deal with this. Should have stayed home. I stayed for the eulogy, which painted Brianna as a visionary who had overcome obstacles to achieve greatness. I listened to readings from business associates praising her leadership, to musical selections celebrating triumph over adversity. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Jason while deliberately ignoring me. I waited until the chapel was mostly empty before standing. "Mr. Sterling?" A man approached, sharply dressed, middle-aged, leather briefcase in hand. "Ben Williams, from Williams Welsh and Associates. Could I have a word?" As the last hymn faded and the funeral director stepped forward with closing remarks, I felt exhaustion settle over me like a heavy coat. The ordeal was nearly over. In a few minutes, I could slip out through the side door, drive back to my quiet apartment, and try to forget the whole humiliating experience. Around me, people gathered their things, purses, and programs, the subtle restlessness signaling a formal event's end. Jason stood near the front, accepting condolences with the ease of someone used to being the center of attention. A few people glanced my way, but most had already written me off as irrelevant to the day's proceedings. I was reaching for my jacket when a voice called out. "Mr. Sterling." Ben Williams approached with calm, measured steps, his expensive suit still impeccable despite the long ceremony. Up close, he looked younger than I expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the confident bearing of a man who had spent decades managing wealthy clients' affairs. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, extending his hand. "Ben Williams, Williams Welsh and Associates. We spoke briefly after the service." "Thank you." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "The service was very nice. Brianna would have appreciated it. She was quite specific about her final arrangements." He paused, glancing around the mostly empty chapel. "I wonder if I might have a word with both you and Jason. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Sterling's estate." Before I could respond, Jason appeared at my shoulder, his expression shifting from practiced grief to keen interest. "Ben, finally. I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things." "Of course, Jason. These matters require careful attention." Ben's voice carried the measured cadence of someone delivering important news. "I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will." "Both of us?" Jason's eyebrows rose. "Is that really necessary?" "I mean, he's not," he gestured vaguely at me. "Your father is specifically named in the will, Jason. His presence is required by law." A flutter of surprise hit me. Named in the will? That seemed unlikely, given everything between Brianna and me. I assumed it was some minor formality, maybe forgiving an old debt or confirming I had no claim. "I don't think it's necessary," I said quietly. "I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there." Ben's eyes met mine directly. "I'm afraid I do, Mr. Sterling." Mrs. Sterling was very specific about who must be present for the reading. "Both you and Jason must attend." Something in his tone left no room for negotiation. Jason looked annoyed but shrugged, the casual confidence of someone who knew he had nothing to fear. "Fine. Let's get this over with." He turned to me with a thinly veiled impatience. "Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be." The walk to Ben's office took us 3 blocks through downtown Rock Springs, past buildings that had watched the town's fortunes rise and fall with the energy industry. Ben made polite small talk, comments about the weather, the turnout at the service, neutral observations that revealed nothing of what awaited us. His office was on the top floor of a restored Victorian house, dark wood, leather-bound books, walls lined with certificates and diplomas, punctuated by photographs of Ben with local dignitaries and business leaders. It was exactly the kind of place Brianna would have chosen, prestigious without being ostentatious, successful yet respectful of tradition. Please have a seat. Ben gestured to two leather chairs in front of his mahogany desk. Jason took the one closest to Ben, leaving me the chair slightly to the side, appropriate given my peripheral role in this process. Ben settled behind his desk and opened a thick file folder, carefully extracting several legal documents. The afternoon sunlight slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room. Before we begin, Ben said, adjusting his glasses, I want to express my condolences again. Brianna was not only a valued client, but someone I considered a friend. Her loss is deeply felt by everyone who knew her. Jason nodded solemnly. I stayed silent, unsure what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased had been so complicated. Ben lifted the top document, several pages bound with a blue backing, and cleared his throat. This is the last will and testament of Laura and Sterling, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Wyoming state law. This will supersedes all previous wills and codicils only 14 months old. I wondered what had prompted Brianna to update her will so recently. Had she been ill? Had something happened that made her contemplate her own mortality? The will confirms that Mrs. Sterling was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that she was under no undue influence or coercion. Ben's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings, each word deliberate. Jason leaned forward slightly, hands clasped together. Anticipation radiated from him, a man ready to claim his inheritance, stepping fully into the empire his mother had built. Ben turned to the second page of the will, his reading glasses catching the sunlight. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises, he read steadily. To my beloved son, Jason Thomas Sterling, I leave the family home at 847, Hillrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Jason smiled, satisfaction spreading across his face. The Hillrest house was worth at least $800,000, a substantial property with mountain views and enough room to entertain business associates properly. Additionally, Ben continued, I bequeath to Jason the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. $500,000, plus the house. I watched Jason carefully, noting the flicker of calculation around the edges of his smile. $500,000 was impressive, but Brianna's business empire was worth far more than that. Where was the rest? Where was the company? That's wonderful, of course, Jason said, his voice trying to mask uncertainty. But what about Mom's business interests? The company? Ben set down the first page and lifted the second, maintaining a neutral expression, his tone professional, measured, unreadable. I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Jason. Please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections, Ben said, his voice calm but firm. I shifted in my chair, feeling more like an intruder with every word. $500,000 was more money than I'd ever seen in a lifetime. Combined with the house, Jason was set up comfortably for years. It felt appropriate, even natural. After all, he was Brianna's son, her chosen successor, the person she'd groomed to inherit her world. Ben went on. The bequest to Jason includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Sterling Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Jason blinked, genuinely confused. Conditions? What do you mean conditions? And, sold. Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written, Jason. These are your mother's words, not mine. I noticed, for the first time, a shift in the room. Attention had crept in, subtle but undeniable. Jason's confident posture faltered slightly, his hands unclenched, then reclenched in his lap. Against my better judgment, I leaned forward, drawn into the tension. Let me understand this clearly, Jason said, his voice tinged with the same edge he'd used at the chapel. I get the house and the $500,000, but there are strings attached. And you're talking about selling the company? That doesn't make sense. Mom would never sell the company. It was her life's work. Ben removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, deliberately, giving all of us a moment to process the words. When he put them back on, his gaze moved between us in a way I couldn't quite read. Your mother's will contains additional provisions addressing the disposition of her remaining assets, he said quietly. The company, her investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well, then let's hear them, Jason demanded, his patience thinning. What are these other provisions? I felt a rising unease. Ben's careful phrasing, the slight apologetic tone creeping in, it reminded me of doctors delivering bad news, the way they prepare patients for a blow. Before I continue, Ben said, settling back, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mrs. Sterling's final, considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation, and she was adamant about their contents. The room fell silent, except for the tick of an antique clock on Ben's bookshelf. Jason stared at the lawyer, alarm growing in his posture, while I tried to understand why Brianna had insisted I be here for what I assumed would be a straightforward family matter. Ben lifted the third page of the will, scanning it briefly before looking up. However, he said, his voice heavy, there are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mrs. Sterling's estate. He lifted his reading glasses and looked directly at me for the first time since we entered. Something in his expression made my stomach twist, a mix of sympathy and professional obligation, signaling that what came next would blow me away. The will contains provisions for the disposition of Mrs. Sterling's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of her estate. Jason leaned forward, hands gripping the armrests. Finally, let's hear about the company and the rest of her investments. Ben cleared his throat, the deliberate pause of someone about to deliver life-changing news. Then, he read slowly, each word landing in the quiet office like stones tossed into still water. To my former husband, Robert Thomas Sterling, I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. I felt my mouth fall open. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. $33.5 million. The number was unreal, didn't seem to belong to someone like me, sitting in a lawyer's office in Rock Springs, Wyoming. There must be some mistake, I managed to whisper. My voice sounded strange, distant. Did you say 33 million? 5 million. Yes, Ben replied, his tone neutral, though I caught a flicker in his eyes, the careful observation of someone expecting chaos. Jason went white, then flushed red, as if his blood couldn't decide which way to flow. What did you just say? Ben continued, unflinching. Additionally, I transfer to Robert Sterling controlling interest in Sterling Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities, with appointment as chairman of the board of directors. I couldn't breathe. The room tilted, as if the laws of physics themselves had been rewritten. Controlling interest in Brianna's company, the empire she had built from nothing, the business that had consumed our marriage, the source of wealth that had made me feel so small, she was giving it all to me. This can't be right, I whispered, my voice barely audible. There has to be some error. I assure you, Mr. Sterling, there is no error. Ben cleaned his glasses again, methodically. These documents were prepared under Mrs. Sterling's direct supervision. She reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were her exact wishes. Jason shot to his feet so fast that his chair rolled back and hit the wall. Impossible. She wouldn't, she couldn't. He turned to stare at me, his expression a mix of pure disbelief and something darker, something I couldn't yet name. What did you do? How could you possibly manipulate her? I croaked, my voice barely holding together as I tried to wrap my head around what I was hearing. I didn't do anything, I added, my words weak, still stuck in disbelief. I hadn't spoken to your mother in 15 years. Jason's voice hit me like a gunshot. People don't just hand over $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her somehow, convinced her while she was sick, when she wasn't thinking clearly. Ben's calm, professional tone sliced through Jason's building hysteria. I can assure you, he said, Mrs. Sterling was fully of sound mind when she signed these documents. She underwent a comprehensive mental competency evaluation, specifically to prevent any future challenges to the validity of her will. I sat frozen, watching the scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The numbers Ben mentioned, $33.5 million, controlling interest in a multimillion-dollar company, belonged to a completely different universe from the one where I worried about grocery bills and car repairs. But why? I found myself whispering the question, a mix of confusion and disbelief. Why would she do this? Ben carefully stacked the will documents. Mrs. Sterling left very clear instructions about that question, Mr. Sterling. She asked me to deliver a personal message to you after reviewing these provisions. Jason's face twisted with rage and betrayal. A personal message? She left him a message but cut me out of everything that mattered. You received a substantial inheritance, Jason, Ben said, his voice calm. $500,000 in valuable property is more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. Jason pointed at me, trembling with anger. Compared to what he's getting? You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The tension in the room was suffocating, I could practically taste it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized my life had just shifted in ways I couldn't even start to comprehend. And yet, all I could focus on was the impossible fact that Laura, stubborn, driven Laura, who had long resented everything I represented, had somehow decided to leave me everything she'd built. That's when Jason lost it completely. This is fraud, he shouted, his voice breaking with rage. Criminal fraud. She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. He spun toward me, his face twisted with fury and disbelief. You did something to her. There's no other explanation. I recoiled in my chair, overwhelmed by his outburst. Jason, I swear, I had no contact with your mother. I didn't even know she was sick. Liar. He slammed his hand down on Ben's desk, sending papers flying. Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when she was dying. She didn't abandon anyone, I said softly, finding a small reserve of strength. Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean it's abandonment. You walked away from us. Jason nearly shrieked. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while she built an empire. And now you want me to believe she just handed it all over to you? Ben's voice cut through again, steady and professional. Mr. Sterling, I understand this is difficult news, but you must control yourself. These are your mother's clearly stated wishes, executed fully and legally. Jason whirled to the lawyer, eyes blazing. I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this man had with my mother in the past 5 years. There were none, Ben said calmly. Mrs. Sterling made that very clear when she explained her decision. Explained her decision. Jason's bitter laugh was sharp. So, she explained why she decided to betray her only son and hand everything to the man who ruined her first marriage. She left a personal message for your father. The word father hit Jason like a physical blow. For a second, the rage flickered, replaced by a raw pain that made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled. He's not my father, Jason snarled. My father would have been there when she needed him. My father would have supported her dreams instead of trying to drag her down. Turning back to me, his face was twisted with years of resentment. You're nothing but a failed man who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you. Each word cut like a knife. Not because they were completely false, but because there was enough truth in them to sting. I had felt inadequate in those last years, struggling with Laura's success, unable to adapt to the world she was creating. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved, but I never asked for this. I never expected this. Expected? Jason's voice rose another octave. You orchestrated this. You somehow got to her when she was vulnerable, sick, scared. That's enough, Ben interrupted, his professional patience finally straining. Mrs. Sterling was neither sick nor vulnerable when she made these decisions. She was more determined and clear-minded than I've ever seen her. Then why? Jason's voice cracked, a mix of rage and hurt. Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her company, I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of. Despite my shock, I saw him clearly in that moment, a man who had spent his entire adult life chasing his mother's approval, only to find she had given her ultimate validation to someone else. She left a message explaining her reasoning, Ben said gently. Would you like me to read it? Jason's hands were trembling now, his whole body vibrating with a mixture of rage and grief. A message. She couldn't tell me face to face, but she left a message for him. Actually, the message spoke to both of us. It was meant to be shared only after the will had been read. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what she had to say. Jason's eyes locked on me, pure hatred burning in them. You have no right to make any decisions here. You have no right to any of this. Even as he spoke, though, I could see the desperation behind his fury, the need to understand why his mother had chosen to upend everything he believed about his place in her world. Ben was already reaching for another envelope, one clearly labeled personal message in Laura's familiar handwriting. He raised a hand, commanding silence with the quiet authority of someone used to controlling emotional courtrooms. Enough, both of you, he said. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. He opened the manila envelope, carefully pulling out several pages of cream-colored stationery. Laura had known this moment would be difficult. She had asked him to read this personal message after the will was announced. Jason slumped in his chair, his anger temporarily replaced by a desperate, almost fearful curiosity. I stayed frozen, part of me too afraid to hope, but desperate for any explanation that could make sense of this impossible situation. Ben cleared his throat and began reading in Laura's own words. My dearest Robert, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Ben's office, wondering if the world has completely lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearranged the living room furniture without warning, confused, but trying to be polite. Despite everything, a ghost of a smile lifted my lips. She had captured that look perfectly, and hearing her voice through Ben's reading made her feel strangely present in the room. I know this inheritance is shocking. You're probably thinking some terrible mistake has been made, that you don't deserve this money or the responsibility, but Robert, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'll tell you why. Ben paused, glancing at both of us before continuing. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights, not during the divorce proceedings, not through these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry at you for not understanding my ambitions, but angrier at myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Robert. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud, too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. Hot tears sprang to my eyes as decades of guilt and regret condensed into this moment of impossible absolution. Jason, the message continued, and I saw my son's head snap up at the sound of his name, my beautiful, brilliant boy. I know you're furious right now, probably convinced your father somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Jason's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions faster than I could track. You've spent your adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing, never had to make the hard choices wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed. That's not true, Jason whispered, but even he sounded unsure. Ben continued reading. Robert taught me about character, integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to me. I was crying openly now, not caring who saw. Laura's words were repairing something I thought had been broken forever, the sense that I had value, that my quiet life of dignity and service meant something. Jason, you've received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human and imperfect. Jason made a sound like a wounded animal, and I couldn't tell if it was rage or pain. Robert, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good, not as a weapon to prove superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this, and because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. The message went on for several more paragraphs, covering practical arrangements and expressing hopes for our futures. But the core was clear, Laura had chosen love over entitlement, character over expectation, wisdom over wealth. When Ben finished, the office fell completely silent. I sat with tears streaking my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Laura had loved me until the end. Jason stared at the floor, his entire world falling apart. Finally, Ben folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. She asked me to give this to you, Robert. The original is yours to keep. I reached for it with trembling hands, holding the last words I would ever receive from the woman who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. The weight of Laura's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, no one spoke. I held the letter to my chest, feeling the reality of her final gift, not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in her eyes, and more importantly, in my own. Jason was the first to break the silence. This isn't over, he said quietly, though the fire had gone out of his voice. I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud, there are ways to challenge a will. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since we'd walked into Ben's office. I saw a man who had spent his whole life expecting the world to bend to his will, someone who had never learned that love can't be inherited or demanded, only earned. You could try, I said gently. But your mother was right, Jason. You're not ready for this responsibility. And you are. His laugh was bitter, hollow. You're a nobody, Dad, a retired power plant worker with no business experience, no connections, no idea what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions. For a moment, the old Robert, the one who had felt inadequate for 22 years, wanted to agree with him. But Laura's words echoed in my mind, you deserve every penny. Maybe you're right, I said slowly, rising to my feet. Maybe I don't know much about running a business empire, but I do know something your mother valued more than business skill. What's that? He snapped. I know the difference between serving others and serving myself. Jason's face twisted with one final flash of rage. This is insane. She was sick. She was old. She wasn't thinking clearly. Ben's voice cut through with professional finality. Your mother was 62 years old and in perfect mental health when she executed these documents. She underwent extensive psychological evaluation specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening. Then why? His voice cracked like a teenager's. Why would she do this to me? I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for this angry man who, despite everything, was still my son. She didn't do it to you, Jason. She did it for you. She gave you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth. I don't want that chance. The words exploded from him, carrying 15 years of entitlement and expectation. I want what's rightfully mine. What's rightfully yours? I said quietly. It's $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you thought you deserved was never really yours to begin with. Jason stared at me for a long moment, and I saw it, the flicker of realization that something fundamental had shifted. The man he had publicly humiliated that morning, the father he had dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for his approval or understanding. You think you've won, he said, gathering his coat with hands that were shaking. You think this makes you some kind of hero? No, I replied, feeling the truth in my bones. I think it makes me responsible. He lingered at the office door for a moment, looking smaller than when he'd entered. This isn't finished. Yes, it is, I said gently. It finished the moment your mother made her choice. The only question now is what you do with the life she's given you. He left without another word. The door closed with a soft click that echoed in the sudden quiet. Ben began organizing papers on his desk, the rustle of documents bringing us back to practical reality. There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's current management team is excellent, they can guide you through your transition. I nodded, still trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. Ben, can I ask you something? Of course. Did she really love me, even after everything that went wrong between us? He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. Robert, she talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems, but about the man who taught her that success without character is just expensive failure. I walked out of that office a changed man. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition, the recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, never truly dies. Laura had seen all of that. And in her final act, she had given me the chance to prove her right. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the left. Thank you for watching.